The Homesteads to Hollywood podcast is a CJSW original production funded by the Radio Meter Program Grant through the Community Radio Fund of Canada. In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, we would also like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, which includes the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary, traditionally recognized by the Blackfoot name of Mohkinstsis, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. Part 1. Movie People. From Cool Runnings to the Revenant and Brokeback Mountain to The Last of Us, cinematic star power didn't just happen to Alberta. In fact, the province has a long and illustrious history in film that has developed into an internationally renowned industry. From Homesteads to Hollywood, Alberta takes center stage in this 10-part exploration into how things came to be and where they're going. My name is Liam Daw.
And I'm Ingrid Vargas. Together we'll be peeling back the layers of Alberta's intricate film industry to answer the question, just how did we get here? There are many elements that each play their role in this ecosystem, such as a storied past, a vibrant underground, a deep talent pool in the trades, and of course, the continuous run-on blockbusters.
It will definitely all come together holistically, but we think it's important, paramount even, to start from the beginning, which is why Part 1, Movie People, examines Alberta's early history. And if you didn't know, it's truly impressive.
It really is. And what I find fascinating is how much about it still holds up today. For over a century, filmmakers have sought out Alberta's incredible landscapes and superior natural lighting, something that still hasn't changed. Whether it was young Frank Borzage, prime Billy Wilder, or Christopher Nolan, Hollywood has always flocked to the backdrops that only Alberta can provide.
And it really goes beyond that. Aside from the label of being the final frontier for natural beauty in this rapid era of industrialization, the province quickly earned a reputation for hospitality. This is something that actually traces back to the Indigenous locals, particularly the Stoney Nakoda, who have a long and dignified background in Canadian cinema.
Which might be something you weren't familiar with. This is because, A, the Nakoda were never credited for any of their contributions, and B, until recently, nobody had ever thoroughly chronicled the origins of Alberta's film industry. Enter Mary Graham, a former journalist with the CBC who took an interest in tracking filming locations around the province, only to realize there wasn't any literature to reference as a guide. This prompted the massive undertaking of telling the story herself.
In late 2022, after 12 years of collective research, Mary published a stunning backdrop through the University of Calgary Press and Bighorn Books. In this beautifully visualized work, Graham uncovers Alberta in the movies from 1917 all the way up to 1960. As a composite of knowledge spanning archives across the continent and the new go-to index for this sort of subject matter, we made the podcast's first priority to catch up with her, and we're positively over the moon when she decided to indulge us.
You can tell by the movies that are filmed here that they are rooted in the landscape and the scenery and the light, but there hadn't been any kind of connecting line through to explain why they're made here. So my husband's Hawaiian, and he was very sick, and we went back to Hawaii, back to Kauai. He's from a little tiny town at the end of the road, and he couldn't do anything. And Kauai has a very famous movie book called the Kauai Movie Book. It's like in the 17th production, and it's basically filming locations. So I had an 8-year-old and a teenager, and that's what we would do. We would drive around and, look at things from the book. When we came back to Alberta, I thought, well, there must be something here, and there was nothing. So I started doing a little bit of research. I was talking to a couple of publishers, and I had been finding things that I didn't understand the significance of them. For example, Ernest Lubitsch and John Barrymore, that film in 1929 was huge. And the more I looked into it, it just kept getting more significant. The history is overwhelming. One of the things I did was visit archives in small towns. And what's really cool about Alberta is that many of the small towns have huge archives on their filmmaking history. You know, for example, the Jasper Archives had a woman in the 1970s who interviewed all of the people in the town who worked in these very, very big productions in the 20s. So the first-hand accounts, Banff has an incredible set of pictures by Peter White, who is the artist, behind the White Museum. I eventually did make my way to the Oscars archives in Los Angeles to do research, and they had a full set of Peter White photos plus more from the studios. And it's things like that kept me moving forward. And it's been incredible to have this thing that is so big, but not written about, and to keep discovering it. And it just, every time I had a hunch, it came true, which as a journalist is great fun.
In the early decades of the 20th century, filmmakers, particularly in Hollywood, were fascinated with the natural light and pristine, undepleted beauty of southern Alberta. During this time, an obsession with realism propelled various production companies to the Canadian Rockies for the purpose of shooting massively popular westerns and the adjacent Northwest melodramas, more commonly known as Mellors, which became a staple of Albertan film.
And as those film genres spiked in popularity, so too did Alberta. Many reputable names in the industry started coming here with bigger and bigger crews, and it wasn't long before Calgary became the travel hub for the ultimately sought locations of Banff and Lake Louise, subsequently creating year-round work and even leading to the establishment of IATSE and the first localized support such as the Mutual Film Corporation and Shipman Kerwood Productions. The 1920s ushered in an unprecedented era of activity for the province, as major motion pictures ventured here regularly. In our conversation with Mary Graham, she mentions that as her research unearthed more connections, she began to understand just how big of a deal this was at the time. Included in some of the early examples is Frank Borzegi's 1922 film, The Valley of the Silent Men.
The Canadian government and the Alberta government had the tourism and settlement agendas, and they definitely promoted the landscapes, particularly of Alberta, as pristine wilderness. One of the things that came up for a century from American filmmakers was that their landscapes had been depleted through industrialization. They view our landscapes as very wild, no man-made structures, very beautiful, very pristine, and also the cinematic light. I mean, they recognized the light in Alberta, back in 1898 when journalists came here. So if you look at every movie filmed in Alberta, every landscape has a prominent foreground, particularly with the mountains, and then there's 4 or 5 layers of landscape going behind it. So even in the prairies, you'll have the prairies, and then you'll have the rise of the Porcupine Hills, and then you'll have the foothills, and then you'll have the mountains. And it's always dreamy and suggesting of other places, and it's otherworldly. And, it's only when I started looking at movies and recognizing this in the landscapes, it's a pretty common trait for most movies filmed in Alberta. The Valley of the Silent Man is very significant. It was done after Borzage won the first sort of Academy Award for humoresque, and everybody was expecting big things from it, but he got obsessed with the landscape, and it's a very beautiful movie, but there's not a lot of story. These guys, John Ford, Herbert Brennan, Herbert Blaish, Lynn Reynolds, Frank Borzage, Reginald Barker, Thomas Ince, they were the young vanguard. They were fascinated with realism. So Thomas Ince is known as the father of the Western. And as the Western became more racist, particularly in the mid-1900s, 1913, 1915, Thomas Ince was actually responsible for that. But he and these young directors fled to Alberta to go back to making more truthful representations of what was going on, not the myth of white settlement or the lionized. So they were looking for realism, and they were looking for the realism in the landscape, the pristine, the wilderness, the anti-industrialization. And when he did come to the Valley of the Silent Man, he was coming back, as Thomas Ince was, to film, please forgive me for this phrase, but to film noble savages, not bloodthirsty, quote-unquote, Indians who were killing the noble pioneers as they, confiscated their land and killed them. So it's a very beautiful movie. He's obsessed with the mountain landscape. You can see it in the movie. He does credit young Frank. He does have some shots of the Nakota in the wilderness helping a Mountie catch a varmint.
It's worth mentioning here that Mary raises a really important notion about the Stoney Nakota and their inclusion in the Frank Borzage film. Her reference to the young Frank that was credited isn't Borzage, but rather the Nakota Frank Powderface. At this point in our research, it was apparent that federal promotion, a cinematic obsession with realism, and the magic natural lighting were collaboratively responsible for luring Hollywood's big names to Alberta, but it was rarely documented, until a stunning backdrop, that much of their motivation to continue productions here came from a mutually beneficial relationship with the Nakota.
A relationship seemingly based off respect. Being indigenous to southern Alberta, the Nakota's mountain expertise was coveted by the Hollywood production crews who had traveled to capture the Rockies. Conversely, these filmmakers offered the Nakota something novel to them, a chance to immortalize their own culture and customs onto film reels. This opportunity was, according to Mary's research, something that the Nakota were very aware of and proactive about. As they interacted more with the quote-unquote movie people from Los Angeles, an understanding for the potential of the young film industry was realized.
And discovering information about the Nakota's historical involvement wasn't exactly surface level either. It took Mary years to develop a rapport strong enough for Nakota elders to share with her their own film archives and pass down oral history. Even then, cross-referencing facts took her all over North America. The Indigenous element to Alberta's film history is something that Mary feels particularly strongly about. This next clip is on the longer side, but we thought it was important to capture her response in its entirety to get a good sense of the significance it holds not only to her, but to the Indigenous peoples like the Nakota back then and today.
It's one of the most inspiring, exhilarating things that I researched. And I was seeing a relationship between Borzage and the Nakota. He came and shot on the Morley Reserve in 1917. A lot of people didn't believe me when I said until they got me was shot there, and that somebody said to me, Borzage wouldn't work with the Indians. And I had found a little 2-story sentence in the LA Times in 1917. Borzage has just returned from the Morley Reserve in Alberta, Canada, shooting until they get me. So I knew it was true. And it took a long, long time to understand how he got there, how he developed the relationship with them, and what sort of connections he would have had to get to know them. The relationship between Banff and Calgary and the Nakota, and I am researching the other bands. I know with the Siksika it was similar. There were a lot of people who recognized the government oppression, and people like Guy Wiedeck and Norm Luxton, who classed as European entrepreneurs who exploit the Nakota, the Brewsters. But that's not what I found. I just found incredibly beautiful stories of people who understood the oppression and the horrible things the government was doing to them through the agendas, through policy, through the treatment, and the brutality of it. And they worked for 40 or 50 years to make things better for them. So Borzage would have met the Nakota through Norm Luxton, who was living out on the reserve in 1917, 6 months a year. The Nakota's horses were in that picture. The elders recognized them. There's only a couple of very short chase scenes that are shot up near 1A near the McDougall Church. Not, that's not at the McDougall Church, which is not a place they really care to talk about. But nobody believed that he would just come up here and do those few scenes, but he did, and they did. They were adventures. They were really cool. In terms of the relation with the Nakota, there were pictures of Borzage, and there was a picture of him with a little boy, and it showed up in the Oscars archives, it showed up in the Library of Congress, it showed up here, and I didn't know who the little boy was, and it was actually Frank Powderface, who was the son of Chief John Powderface, who was responsible for getting a lot of the actors out of the crevasse in the 1922 movie. And there's photographs of them camping together, and there's photographs of Borzage with young Frank Powderface on his shoulders, and he credits him in the film, and he actually taught him to raise his hands at white people and go, "Hi, mucky muck." But I was very reluctant to kind of define that relationship, and I actually met another, a Kenai or Piikani elder They all have fantastic histories in film that are just coming to light, and they all talk about them differently. And I said to him, we were at a function actually here at the university, and I said to him, am I right in saying that these directors many of them had very good relationships with you? And he said, absolutely. And he told me some stories about modern day. It's his story, so I won't repeat it, but he sort of explained the relationship to me, and it's incredible. So with the relationships with the directors, with the Nakota, because they had this relatively good relationship, and a lot of people worked to get them off the reserves because they weren't allowed to practice their rituals, which there's nothing wrong with their rituals. It's their culture. But they were seen as taboo and a return to savagery. I have two minds about it. A lot of times when filmmakers and prominent people came here, they were brought out to the Nakota to meet them as sort of an exotic undertaking. But what really changed my ideas about that actual relationship, well, there were two or three things. I found a picture of the Nakota in full regalia standing on the train, or by the train tracks as what they believe is Borzagi was going by to Banff, showing deep respect. One thing we did find in those early movies is that the Nakota put messages to the future to their people. For example, in the 1954 movie Saskatchewan, what I did with the elders is we watched every movie. At one point, Raoul Walsh has them speaking in Nakota, and Chief Walking Buffalo, very famous Nakota peace activist, said, "Don't talk, the cameras are laughing." We all thought it was hilarious, and they told us what he was saying because he was speaking in Nakota, which is also a huge compliment for a director to put their language in. And then the mood in the room got very sober because you could hear a chant through the woods, and it was very sad. When they signed the treaty, they were duped into signing it. One of the chiefs was away, and as they were signing it, I don't want to say warriors. I don't know. They're people. The cabin where it was being signed and chanted, and I don't want to say a war song, but they would have to clarify what they would call it. And that Raoul Walsh included that war song in the movie. It was a very powerful message to their people in these days that they did not sign that treaty willingly, and they wanted them to know. So for the directors to do things like that, and in particularly Borzagi started it, you don't just put something like that in a movie. It's very deliberate, and it also shows agency on the Nakota's part and strategy. They were extremely clever, and they've been living in brutal, oppressive, horrible 150 years that basically we've tried to eliminate them and kill their children, and kill their culture. And that was their strategy for speaking to the future and moving forward. And we're finding more. I think there's 3 or 4 that have been recognized as messages.
During this run, Alberta became known not only for its backdrops, but also for the hospitality of its production crews and locals. This is something that filmmaker Thomas Meighan picked up on while filming his 1926 film, The Canadian. He was apparently so impressed with his time in Calgary that he approached then-Mayor George Harry Webster to help organize a fundraiser to thank the city as they wrapped up filming. The cast and crew members even wrote an original play, Making Movies in Calgary, as an homage to the citizens.
The good times didn't last forever, though, as the 1930s provided several challenges to Alberta's film industry. The Great Depression shifted the world into economic downturn, and during this same period, New Mexico branded itself as the new mecca for producing westerns, drawing many filmmakers away from Alberta. On top of this, the British Cinematograph Act of 1927, amended in 1935, prolonged this ongoing decline. Eventually, things began to pick up, and in 1937, a return to glory came in the form of the British action-adventure film Silent Barriers.
The 1940s brought American war propaganda films to the forefront of the industry, and Alberta was featured in some prominent productions during this era. The Michael Powell war drama, 49th Parallel, was filmed here in 1941. If you're an alt history buff and want to see an obscure British-Canadian co-production, check this out. No spoilers, but it's pretty bizarre.
The mounted police has reason to suspect that among this crowd are 3 enemies of this country. They are not ordinary aliens escaped from Kananaskis internment camp. They are survivors from a German submarine, the notorious U-37, which was sunk in Hudson Bay by our Air Force. These men are here in this courtyard. They may be standing right next to you. Each one of you, look closely at your neighbor.
Among others, 1945's Son of Lassie captured Banff National Park in Technicolor for the first time. 1948 marked Alberta's unofficial exit from its post-war so-called coma in prominent fashion, as Banff and Jasper welcomed some of Hollywood's biggest names at the time.
They were looking for alpine scenes, and Billy Wilder probably wanted to shoot in Alberta because so many big directors had before him, and there's kind of a myth about it among them, and also the cinematographers want to come here. So in terms of significance for Alberta, number one, it's a Billy Wilder movie, a Brackett Wilder movie. Number two, it's a Bing Crosby movie. There's a huge amount of historic material in the Jasper archives about the filming of that picture, and that material gives you another look at filming, at our history and actually how things went down. They came in, hundreds of them, and they came up in convoys, and Bing Crosby brought his Barney Dean, his speech writer, or his writer, so that Billy Wilder did not have control over the whole script, and that was very evident in the movie, that you had the wisecracking American versus this high art European musical. It's significant simply for the people involved. I mean, there was Frank Inn, the huge animal trainer. Edith Head did the costumes, the makeup. The Wetmores were here. So if you look at the people that were here, not necessarily the film that was made, because it was just post-war, and it, as people have said, it was very un-Wilder. It's not one of his better-known films. But in retrospect, it is a movie of its time, and probably they hadn't absorbed the atrocities of the Second World War.
It wasn't very long after the Billy Wilder and Bing Crosby craze that Albertans were starstruck by another Hollywood icon. Otto Preminger's 1954 film River of No Return brought Marilyn Monroe to the province for the very first time, and it wasn't a small deal either. Up to that point, Alberta had hosted its fair share of movie stars and big-time filmmakers, but the presence of Monroe around Calgary, Banff, and Jasper generated a whole new level of buzz.
As Marilyn Monroe was becoming a household name and the most enduring sex symbol of the era, her fame also came with unparalleled scrutiny and censure. Monroe, at just 28, marked a turning point in Albertan cinema, where many consider the intersection of early history concluding and modern history beginning.
She was just starting to rise, and the whole winter before she came, there'd been a huge outcry about her half-naked carcass appearing in films and the long shots on her rear end. And Joan Crawford said she was being manipulated by master manipulators, and Adolf Zucker said it was going to save the industry, bringing sex into the industry. So she was very young when she came here, and in Jasper, I was shocked at how many times she and Joe DiMaggio had dinner with the locals or invited them for dinner. They were a little more protected in Jasper because it's more isolated, and Jasper tends to engulf the stars and have a very intimate relationship with them that's not shared with the outside world. Well, it was Otto Preminger who shot it as well. The one thing about that movie is that it had been shot on Nakota Reserve, but a lot of times in the news stories and the studio stories, those filming locations are not identified. And it was only working with the Nakota when I realized how much had been done. They did shoot at the bend in the river, and she had actually apparently camped with the Nakota when they were shooting those scenes. So, and then there's very little is known about that. So in terms of significance, I think a lot of people would say River of No Return is not a huge movie. It was certainly one of the biggest moneymakers that year. But I think if you look at the significance of the time and how she was and how the industry was and the director and the movie, it's a really good movie. It's a fantastic movie. It had ramifications for the Alberta film industry that continue today.
$1 silver, $1 silver, changing hearts, changing lives, changing hands.
If you're an Albertan, you might take the grasslands, the engulfing sky, and Rockies for granted. Our prairie winters can be biting, eternal even, but we always have the sun. We have some of the most beautiful lighting and landscapes a filmmaker could ask for. And as for our crews and technicians, their talent, kindness, and dedication goes above and beyond the experience you would have filming anywhere else in Canada. Believe me, I've lived it. It's not just me, though. Some of the most prolific filmmakers tie the threads of Alberta's beauty into their pictures, through different timelines, periods, and narratives.
The one thing that I've learned from this book is that these directors have connections to each other and are influenced by each other. And if you look at the directors who film in Alberta, it's shocking the number of monstrously huge directors in the last century that come here. If you look at the movies here, filmed here, I mean, Brokeback Mountain was very specifically shot here. He wanted to film it here. Terrence Malick wanted to film Days of Heaven here. It wasn't simply a matter of, going to the cheapest or most lucrative or most, tempting place to shoot or most efficient place to shoot. When I first saw Days of Heaven, I thought, oh my goodness, he's made an homage to the early directors who came here. It's a Northwester in his vision of a Northwester. Historically, it's a far bigger impact in terms of the quality of the product made here. The significance of the movies made here are global, and they're lasting. We're not going to forget them. Nobody's going to forget Brokeback Mountain. Nobody's going to forget Unforgiven. Nobody's going to forget The Last of Us. Toronto and Vancouver, because of the understanding of their government of how film jurisdictions work and how production works, I think it was probably since the 1980s, they have steadily surpassed Alberta in terms of volume because there's a lot more incentive for producers to shoot there. And Alberta has kind of sunk into this sort of weird, not as big as Toronto, not as big as Vancouver. Alberta is in many ways bigger than Toronto, bigger than Vancouver, and it always has been and it always will be. And I don't see any sign of it ever stopping. They come for the landscapes. They come for, as I said, the light.
First, we'd like to extend our utmost gratitude and appreciation to Mary Graham. Right now, nobody else is collecting the depth of information on Alberta's history in film that she is, and this podcast is that much better for it. Through Mary's own voice, you've heard several of the many anecdotes related to the distant beginnings, Indigenous involvement, and straight-up star power, each being a part of the bigger story that is Alberta in cinema. We went back and forth on this a little bit, but ultimately decided that this province's important relationship with Hollywood needed more than one episode to properly illustrate just how significant it really is. If you're like us and are curious about what Alberta in the movies looked, sounded, and felt like during the 1970s all the way through to the 2000s, don't worry. We connected with perhaps the most qualified person alive who can speak to it. For part 2 of Homesteads to Hollywood, we'll be talking to the legendary stuntman, wrangler, and rancher, John Scott.
I've been very fortunate to work with some great people here locally that no one person can do this job by themselves. You're only as good as the people you got around you. And if you've got people around you that you can trust and make things happen, it will happen.
Homesteads to Hollywood is a CJSW original recorded and produced in Calgary, Alberta. Our outreach coordinator is Natalie Schmidt. Audio editing is from Maria Pladneva. Assistant production and research from Ingrid Vargas, and is executively produced by myself, Liam Daw. Music for this episode, including the theme track you heard during the intro, is composed by Calgary's own Young Neighbors. In order of appearance, film clips used throughout the episode come from Ernest Lubitsch and United Artists' 1929 film Eternal Love, Michael Powell and Columbia Pictures' 1941 film 49th Parallel, and the Otto Preminger 20th Century Fox 1954 picture River of No Return.